The jungle was still, the road ahead quiet. American armored vehicles moved cautiously along a stretch of Highway 1, just east of Saigon. Soldiers scanned the dense tree line on both sides, aware that at any moment everything could change. And it did. Gunfire exploded from the underbrush. RPGs slammed into the lead vehicles. Tracer rounds streaked through the air. A U.S. convoy had driven straight into a Viet Cong kill zone. Dozens of enemy fighters unleashed a coordinated ambush, determined to wipe the Americans off the map in minutes. But the Viet Cong had miscalculated. What followed wasn't panic or retreat. It was one of the most aggressive counterattacks of the early war. American troops charged straight through the ambush, flanked the attackers, and turned the jungle trap into a devastating defeat for the enemy. In less than 48 hours, over 100 Viet Cong were dead, their leadership shattered, and the road was cleared. This was Operation Atlanta, a mission few people talk about, but one that marked the arrival of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment in Vietnam. Their task was simple: secure the roads and build a base deep in hostile territory. What they encountered was anything but. If you're into the real, often overlooked stories of modern warfare, stories with grit, stakes, and hard decisions, go ahead and like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell. It helps us keep telling these forgotten chapters of combat history. Let's go back to Vietnam. Let's go to Operation Atlanta. By late 1966, the Vietnam War had escalated beyond anything the Pentagon originally imagined. Over 250,000 American troops were now in country, scattered across jungles, rice paddies, and remote outposts. But for all their firepower, U.S. forces were learning the hard way that controlling terrain in Vietnam meant more than capturing ground. It meant holding the roads. Highway 1 was the artery that connected South Vietnam's key cities, running from Saigon to the northern border. Control of this road meant movement, supply, survival, and east of Saigon, near the town of Xuan Loc, that road was anything but safe. Viet Cong units had spent years building hidden camps, tunnels, and ambush points throughout the region. Convoys that rolled out without heavy escort rarely made it through untouched. To deal with the growing threat, the U.S. Army deployed one of its most powerful new tools, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, the Blackhorse Regiment. Fresh from training at Fort Meade and Fort Irwin, these soldiers were equipped with fast-moving, heavily armed M113 armored personnel carriers, nicknamed ACAVS. These weren't typical infantry units. They were designed to strike hard, move fast, and hold terrain under fire. When the 11th ACR landed in Vietnam, their first assignment was straightforward but dangerous. Secure Highway 1, protect the key supply routes between Bien Hoa and Xuan Loc, and establish a new forward operating base, Blackhorse Base Camp, deep in Dong Nai Province. The operation was given a name, Operation Atlanta. It would begin with road-clearing patrols, convoy escort missions, and perimeter security. On paper, it looked manageable. In reality, the regiment was entering one of the most contested zones in the Third Corps, where the Viet Cong 274th Regiment had been operating freely for years. This enemy force, also known as the Dong Nai Regiment, was no ragtag militia. It was a seasoned unit that specialized in ambushes, harassment tactics, and hit-and-run attacks. They knew the terrain, had local support, and were well armed. And they weren't going to let the Americans move in without a fight. The stage was set: a newly arrived U.S. cavalry force, a critical road network under threat, and an enemy regiment determined to strike first. Operation Atlanta wasn't just a routine mission, it was a test of equipment, tactics, and willpower. No one knew it yet, but one of the most decisive jungle ambushes of the year was just weeks away. October 19, 1966, Operation Atlanta officially began. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, still new to Vietnam, moved into the jungle with a clear mission: secure the roads, sweep the area, and establish a permanent base at a location south of Xuan Loc. From the start, it was clear this wasn't going to be a quiet introduction to the war. Their area of operations stretched across the critical corridor between Bien Hoa and Xuan Loc, a zone packed with rubber plantations, rice paddies, and dense vegetation perfect for ambushes. The terrain was unfamiliar, the humidity relentless, and the enemy invisible. But the Blackhorse Regiment was designed for mobility and shock power. They pushed forward quickly. The regiment split into patrols, securing key stretches of Highway 1 and Route 2, vital arteries feeding supplies from coastal ports and Saigon to inland combat units. Their M113A CAVs, bristling with machine guns and grenade launchers, formed armored convoys that moved like steel walls down the roads. Engineers worked to clear mines and booby traps, while infantry teams scouted the tree line. The Viet Cong didn't strike immediately, and that made things worse. Days passed in tense silence. The enemy was watching, studying. U.S. troops moved supplies to the new Blackhorse Base Camp site, carving out a footprint in the middle of hostile territory just a few miles off the main highway. The camp took shape fast. Bulldozers cleared brush, artillery units dug in, helicopter pads were cut into the grass. It wasn't secure yet, but it was coming together. The regiment's movement patterns followed a tight schedule. Escort convoys by day, secure the roads by afternoon, and fortify the base overnight. In between, the Blackhorse troopers dealt with sniper fire, nighttime probes, and scattered roadside bombs, harassment attacks designed to wear them down, not wipe them out. Yet something felt off. The enemy wasn't pushing hard. Not yet. What no one knew was that the Viet Cong 274th Regiment had already begun planning a full-scale ambush. They had watched the Americans arrive. They had scouted their routes. They knew the timing of their convoys. And they had picked the perfect stretch of road near a tiny hamlet called Ap Hunga. The trap was being built silently, just out of sight. Meanwhile, the Americans pushed deeper into the AO, unaware of how close they were to one of the most violent ambushes of the early war. Each day brought them closer to danger. Each convoy moved more supplies into the base, and one step closer to the kill zone. November 20th, 1966. It started like any other convoy run, a resupply column made up of M113 armored carriers and cargo trucks rolled out from the staging area, heading east toward the growing Blackhorse base. The terrain around Ap Hunga, a quiet hamlet tucked between Highway 1 and a narrow stream, was calm. Too calm. What the Americans didn't know was that over 2 full battalions of the Viet Cong 274th Regiment were lying in wait just beyond the tree line. They had spent days preparing the ambush, digging fire pits, dragging heavy weapons into position, and charting the perfect stretch of road. On maps, it was a supply route. On the ground, it was a kill zone. As the lead vehicles passed a bend in the road, the jungle exploded. Automatic gunfire ripped through the air. Rocket-propelled grenades tore into the sides of the convoy. Explosions sent dirt and shrapnel flying in all directions. Within seconds, the U.S. column was under full-scale attack from both flanks. The kill zone was expertly constructed. The VC had set up overlapping fields of fire and targeted the middle of the convoy to cut off escape in either direction. Trees along the roadside flashed with muzzle fire. Mortars landed with dull, thunderous impacts just ahead of the lead vehicles. It was the kind of ambush designed to trap and annihilate an entire unit. And for a moment it looked like it might succeed. But the troopers of the 11th ACR didn't stop. By the time the fighting died down, over 100 Viet Cong lay dead, scattered through the jungle and along the roadsides. Captured documents later revealed the scale of the loss. 3 battalion commanders and 4 company commanders from the 274th Regiment had been killed. The unit's leadership had been devastated. On the American side, casualties were surprisingly low, especially considering the scale of the engagement. Several soldiers were killed and wounded, and multiple vehicles were damaged or destroyed. But the convoy had survived, and the enemy had been shattered. Instead of trying to reverse or hunker down, the column's lead elements broke through the kill zone at full speed. M113 crews opened fire in all directions, their .50 cals and grenade launchers saturating the jungle. Crews fired from the top hatches, exposing themselves to sniper fire to return rounds downrange. The middle of the convoy, now pinned down, began to regroup. Troop commanders coordinated with artillery batteries back at Blackhorse Base. Within minutes, 105mm shells began landing along the tree line, ripping through VC positions. Helicopter gunships arrived overhead, unleashing rockets and minigun fire on the eastern flank. Then came the counterattack. American armor from the rear of the convoy moved to outflank the ambushers. Infantry squads began pushing into the brush, forcing the Viet Cong to either fight at close range or fall back. The element of surprise was gone, and the Americans had momentum. What was supposed to be a perfectly executed ambush quickly turned into a chaotic retreat for the VC. They hadn't anticipated such an aggressive response, or the sheer volume of firepower the 11th ACR could bring to bear so quickly. The battle near Ap Hunga became one of the most decisive small unit victories of late 1966. The 11th Armored Cavalry had not only survived its first major engagement, it had done so under the worst possible conditions and come out on top. And perhaps most importantly, it had proven that even a carefully prepared ambush could be broken when speed, coordination, and overwhelming fire were unleashed without hesitation. In the days following the ambush at Ap Hunga, the tempo shifted. The Viet Cong 274th Regiment, once confident in its ability to dominate the highway corridor, was now in retreat. Its leadership shattered, its manpower gutted, and its credibility among local supporters damaged by the failed ambush. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment had not only fought through the fire, they had taken control of it. With the area temporarily cleared of organized resistance, the focus turned fully to the completion of Blackhorse Base Camp. Nestled just a few kilometers south of Xuan Loc, the camp quickly evolved from a jungle clearing into a fully functional forward operating base. Engineers expanded the perimeter. Artillery batteries were emplaced and calibrated. Communication networks linked the base to Bien Hoa in Saigon. The airstrip was completed, allowing for light aircraft and helicopters to come and go regularly. Daily convoy runs resumed, now protected by hardened ambush protocols and armored escorts. The lessons from Ap Hunga had changed the game. Patrols began pushing further outward from the base, establishing buffer zones and engaging in local search-and-clear operations to disrupt remaining VC elements in the region. The psychological impact was just as significant. For local villages caught between the Viet Cong and ARVN forces, the presence of a heavily armed U.S. regiment, with visible dominance over the region's key roads, was a statement. The Americans weren't just passing through. They were here to stay. Blackhorse Base became more than a camp. It was a permanent headquarters for the 11th ACR's operations in South Vietnam and would serve as a launch point for future campaigns across 3 Corps. The men who had landed in Vietnam as a newly deployed regiment just weeks earlier were now seasoned by combat. Their armor had been tested, their tactics had evolved, and their morale was solidified by victory. But no one mistook that success for safety. Patrols still encountered tripwires, convoys still braced for ambush. The jungle hadn't surrendered. It had simply fallen quiet again. Still, the Americans had taken the initiative. Operation Atlanta had done more than secure ground. It had given the U.S. cavalry a foothold and momentum. Operation Atlanta wasn't just a victory on paper. It became a template, one of the first hard-earned examples of how American armored forces could adapt to Vietnam's brutal, asymmetric terrain. It exposed gaps in existing doctrine and forced commanders to refine their approach in real time. The ambush at Ap Hunga was especially instructive. Until then, conventional convoy doctrine often emphasized holding position under fire, calling in support, and regrouping. But Vietnam didn't follow rules. The jungle gave the enemy concealment, and the roads gave them choke points. If you stopped, you died. Atlanta made it clear. The only way out was forward, smashing straight through the fire. The counter-ambush tactic, executed under pressure during the battle, became standard practice for armored convoys in high-threat areas. Mobility became a weapon in itself. Another critical lesson was the value of combined arms coordination. During the engagement, the 11th ACR had integrated artillery, helicopter gunships, and armor in a matter of minutes. That kind of response wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. The Viet Cong ambushers were overwhelmed, outflanked, and hit from the air, ground, and distance all at once. That fusion of assets became a model for future operations across the 3rd Corps. Atlanta also solidified the combat role of the ACAV, the M113 Armored Cavalry Assault Vehicle. Originally a transport, it had been modified with extra firepower and open-top crew stations. Critics worried the design left crews too exposed, But in Atlanta, the ACAV proved it could not only survive but dominate in close jungle combat, with its .50 caliber guns and grenade launchers creating a mobile wall of fire that few VC units could break through. Internally, the operation forced the 11th ACR to sharpen its procedures. Every soldier now knew how to react under fire. Every convoy knew its formations, radio calls, fallback protocols. The regiment learned to rotate units rapidly between road security and jungle sweeps, maintaining pressure without burning out its crews. And beyond tactics, Atlanta had a deeper effect. It gave the 11th Cavalry its identity in Vietnam. No longer just a newly arrived unit, the regiment had earned its place as a trusted armored hammer in the region. Their success reassured senior commanders and gave frontline soldiers a boost of hard-won confidence. Operation Atlanta wasn't a large-scale offensive, but it shaped how American forces fought and survived. Operation Atlanta doesn't show up in many history books. It wasn't a massive offensive like Operation Junction City or a politically explosive event like the Tet Offensive. It was small in scale, local, tactical, immediate, but its impact reached far beyond the jungles around Xuan Loc. Atlanta was a proof of concept. It demonstrated that armored cavalry, when used aggressively and intelligently, could operate effectively in Vietnam's hostile terrain. Many in the military had doubted whether heavy vehicles like the M113 ACAV could survive in a guerrilla war defined by jungle ambushes and hit-and-run tactics. Atlanta shut down that skepticism. It also set the tone for the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment's role in the war. From Blackhorse Base, the regiment launched future operations throughout Third Corps, including major engagements during 1967 and 1968. The base became a strategic hub, allowing rapid response to flare-ups across the region. Without Operation Atlanta, that foothold wouldn't have existed. On a broader level, the operation reflected a growing shift in U.S. military strategy. The war had begun with light patrols and counterinsurgency doctrine, but by late 1966, the Pentagon recognized it needed firepower, mobility, and dominance to hold contested ground. Atlanta embodied that shift. Armored columns, helicopter support, and direct engagement. It was no longer just about winning hearts and minds. It was about securing supply lines and eliminating threats. The Viet Cong, for their part, learned lessons too. Atlanta showed that the Americans were not easily intimidated. The failure of the ambush at Ap Hunga forced the 274th Regiment to adapt, retreat, and rebuild. It was a reminder that even a well-executed guerrilla tactic could backfire when the enemy responded with discipline and overwhelming force. For the men who fought it, Atlanta was unforgettable. It was their first real test, an abrupt initiation into the harsh reality of combat. Veterans of the 11th ACR would carry the memory of that battle for the rest of their lives. The smell of cordite, the roar of engines, the deafening jungle, the feeling of steel pushing through fire. In the grand arc of the Vietnam War, Operation Atlanta was just a few weeks on the calendar. But in those weeks, a regiment found its footing, a strategy evolved, and a message was sent. The U.S. cavalry was in country, and it could hit back just as hard as it was hit. It started with a quiet jungle road and ended in fire, smoke, and shattered silence. Operation Atlanta wasn't about seizing territory or launching grand offensives. It was about control, holding roads, building a base, and proving that American forces could survive, adapt, and fight on enemy terms. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment didn't just endure its first trial in Vietnam, it crushed it. Against a well-planned ambush, they brought firepower, speed, and coordination that broke the Viet Cong assault and rewrote the rules of jungle warfare. From that moment on, the enemy knew convoys weren't soft targets anymore. The roads would be fought for, and the cavalry would not back down. These are the moments that never make the headlines, but they're the backbone of real history. Small units,